You know what's fun? Trauma. There's a reason it's at the heart of many of our greatest stories. You show me a book where a character lives happily ever after, and I don't call that a magnum opus. That's just Shrek. Despite what the sad backstory community would claim, having tormented memories isn't all it's cracked up to be. But that all changed in February 2023 with the release of one particular game, Limbus Company. And the following is a recreation of true events. Wow, they're just like me! I can't wait to tell God about this! Damn it! These are the Sinners, the collective name for the 13 playable characters that make up Limbus Company. Why are they called Sinners? We don't exactly know yet, but each one of them has some form of traumatic incident in their lives they're trying to move past, with each segment of the game's story focusing on a single one. And about now you might be thinking, but Frey, I've gone through bad stuff before and I'm not a sinner, I just feel bad, and that's not a sin. And to that I want to say, I'm so sorry you had to find out this way. These are sins, one of the most paramount aspects of being a sinner. In Limbus Company, you'll get these as consumable resources whenever you use most moves in its RPG-style fights. Get enough of a certain type and you can dish out some super-powered attacks, or trigger some passive effects. It's a fun, color-coded system that allows you to mix turn-based combat with resource management. But beyond being gaming's latest affront to God, what exactly are sins? I mean, it's not like you get these coins as a literal currency. In Project Moon, the developers of Limbus Company have a history of making sure their gameplay mechanics make sense in their universe. So let's take a moment to find out just what exactly these colorful little icons are made of. And to do that, we'll first have to turn back the clock. Project Moon's made a few games over the years, including their flagship management game, Lobotomy Corporation, and the more acclaimed Library of Ruina, a card battling game that's getting a release on Switch in 2024. But while all three games take place in the same universe, there are also web novels that came out in between these games that act as side stories. And this is where we get our first mention of the power of sin, more specifically, in the story Leviathan. That's right!
You thought that was the end of my
Leviathan essays?
Oh, I still have one more
Video!
to give you!
While a lot goes on in the novel, all you really need to know is that it follows the life of a man named Virgilius who is infiltrating an underground art auction to save some orphans. In the process, Virgilius comes across a member of the group called a docent who's giving him trouble and needs to deal a decisive strike. Knowing this, he starts channeling a power he calls Shin by clearing his mind and focusing on memories that have a great emotional impact on him. He thinks of the kids he would bring presents to on Christmas Eve. He remembers everything from the colorful wrapping paper to the snow on the ground and the smiles on their faces. Until finally, he recalls a terrible event that would befall them later involving two certain people. Keeping both the hopeful and crushing memories in his mind, his body moves weightlessly towards his adversary until finally, two solid rings of light wrap around his leg as it's plunged into the docent's abdomen, pushing her off the cliffside and into the abyss. Moved only by his mind, Virgilius walks away from the fight, admiring the power of this light, calling it the power of sin. And it's here I'd like to bring attention to the kinds of words used in this story. The official Leviathan chapter is translated from Korean, so there were some choices the translators made in how to word the English version. In the process, one translator's note mentions using the proper noun Shin to describe the power Virgilius used. This was due to Shin being the Japanese pronunciation of the Han Chinese character, which pertains to the mind. And if that's jumping through too many linguistic hoops for you, the translators are saying that the power Virgilius uses is meant to be related to the word sin, but also have a root meaning in being from the mind. As a result of this, the community has interpreted Shin and Sin as being the same thing, or at least very similar in nature. This means that the power of sin isn't literally the power found through sinning, Dad, but instead the power found through channeling emotions through one's memories. And since Leviathan ended before Limbus Company came out, we would soon see other characters make use of this power displayed by the glowing rings adorning their attacks. However, one group of people notably has not been able to use these rings, and that's the Sinners. Yeah, even though this group's namesake involves these dramatic shiny hula hoops, not a single one of them have made these so far. And the idea of Shin doesn't even address the different sin types that make up the resources in the game. So what gives? Are they just bad at their job? Well, jury's out on that for some people, but Project Moon still hasn't fully explained their power system yet. It's actually kind of funny how they do a lot of showing and not telling on this topic in a visual novel of all things. However, I believe we have enough information to not only explain what these kinds of sins are, but why the sinners are so different from other Shin users. For the sake of this explanation, I'm going to make a distinction between the words we've found for this power. Shin will be used to refer to the power found from channeling these thoughts, while Sin will be the different kinds of Shin. If it's easier, think of Shin as me talking about Skittles, while Sin is me talking about flavors of Skittles. And that's super important because there is one other distinction to make between the Sinners and regular Shin users. The Sinners may not be able to make use of the Rings of Light, but none of the Shin users, even Virgilius, have made use of a single of the Sin resources from the game. More specifically, they're not making use of the Sin resources that fuel one of the game's most powerful mechanics, Ego. Now I could make another video on this topic alone, but Ego in Limbus Company is a power system that allows the sinners to channel abilities that come from creatures that embody certain experiences and emotions. For instance, a sinner like Merceau could channel wrath and pride sins in order to call upon the power of a rampaging prisoner enraged by being confined. And each sinner has their own ego move that can be channeled from their memories in much the same way. But while there are means for characters other than the sinners to make use of ego in Project Moon's system, nobody is able to use it in quite this way. For my One Piece fans out there, it's like the difference between someone having a devil fruit power and someone else not having any, but being able to lease the powers from any of them for just a moment. And why would it work this way just for them? Because at the start of Limbus Company, every single sinner signed a contract that restricted their power in order to better connect with the treasure the company was made to find. This had the added benefit of being able to use the sin resources, and each of these resources has their own sin type that's channeled based on the emotion the move evokes. Every move in both Limbus Company and the previous game, Library of Ruina, is based on a certain thought that the user would have in their head. Another example. There's a playable version of Merceau that acts as a chronically overworked office employee with a hammer. Don't ask me why, we'll be here all day. And each of his skills, rather than referring to some special move, refer to some thought or experience of his day-to-day life. Saddle tasks? Well, that's a hopeless reality for a passive office worker. That baby is Gloom flavored. Forced break? What, with so much left to do? That's gotta be a prideful action if I ever heard one. Finishing Roundup might make for a good attack name, but for the modern wage slave, that's just a sign that rest is near, so sloth me up, baby. In short, the sinner's contract is what allows them to easily use a different flavor of Shin to borrow powers based on the different memories they make use of in battle. And the sins are the different ways that power takes form. Now that we know this, let's take a look at what exactly those sins are. Now, some of the sins will have more documented information on them than others, but there's enough to interpret something from all of them. First up is Wrath, which is a pretty straightforward one. Wrath is channeled through anger and wanton destruction. If the emotion is best described as leaving everything broken, including yourself in some cases, it'll fall under this. Wrath is also the sin type most likely to inflict the burn status, which gradually does damage over time. Next up is Lust, which is somehow both the most acknowledged sin in Limbus, but also the most misunderstood, at least to me. Considering that Project Moon's vibe doesn't usually include people porkin', Lust has been used to showcase a longing for the human form, any human emotional connection, or the concept of humanity itself. It's also associated with the bleed status effect, which deals more damage the more a person moves. Almost like it triggers on someone approaching you. Isn't that sweet? Virgilius also fights an embodiment of lust in Leviathan, which causes him to think back on a moment of how much the kids at the orphanage wanted to see him smile. It's also worth mentioning here that just because we're calling these sins, doesn't mean they're inherently bad. Then again, this is also the sin that Cromer more than embodies, so fuck me, I guess. And much how I don't care enough to change my own choice of words, our next sin type is Sloth. This is one of the sins that isn't quite as well known, but both the name and the description of the creature that embodies it suggest that this sin is about anywhere between seeking comfort to laziness and a desire to not move or be moved. What matches up very well, though, is how this is the sin associated with the Tremor status effect. Unlike other effects that deal damage or are used as buffs, those don't count. Tremor is used to stagger and inflict several other debuffs on opponents, making it difficult for them to move. And I just think that's neat. What's also neat is how this next sin acts as a twofer. Gluttony here refers to any emotion of wanting something to an obsessive degree. This can be anything from knowledge to ambition, or just plain food. It's also fitting that gluttony is a sin that takes anything it can into itself, not only because of how its embodiment works, but also because it's acting as the replacement for the greed sin. Yeah, so greed didn't end up making the cut in this list. I've seen a few conversations as to why, but what makes the most sense to me is that if both greed and gluttony were here, they'd feel way too similar. And this just feels like the right call. Gluttony is also the sin most associated with rupture, which causes those inflicted to take more damage upon being hit. It's just like getting a gut punch after a steak dinner. But could someone explain to me why 7 Heathcliff's forensic skill is gluttony? Like, I'm pretty sure that one was added in for gameplay balance and gameplay theming, but lore-wise, I just don't really see it. This part's not even in the script. Like, I just kind of want to know. And if that fact made you disappointed, then get ready to be in good company, because now we're on to the Gloom sin. This one's about as direct as wrath, but instead of it being about anger, it's about sadness, lethargy, and helplessness. If Project Moon wasn't careful, this sin could have been lumped together with sloth, but I really like the balance they struck with sloth being more about ignoring problems, and gloom being about drowning in them. It's even more fitting that this sin type is associated with the sinking status, which lowers the sanity of opponents, causing them to be weaker and less accurate. Also, sinking to luge is just a treat. It may not be gloom, but not a lot can top that. If anything were to try though, that would be pride. Much like sloth and one other sin on this list, there isn't as much information on this one. However, we can still get a good idea of what it represents from the creature that embodies it. To summarize the logs, the wheel has often been the symbol of technological advancement. That may be why pride takes the form of a wheel. It doesn't care if it gnashes at flesh or crushes patches of grass, because it can roll while others cannot. I think we can safely say that any prideful thought involves justifying harming or taking from others because of something you possess, whether that's wealth or some personal trait. Like many of the others, this matches up great with pride skills giving their users the poise status, which allows them to make critical hits. I mean, look, I believe in humility and all that, but if I was a mercenary and could make a pinpoint stab through someone's heart, that'd probably go to my head at least a little. And speaking of things worth stabbing, there's this bastard! Welcome to Envy, the sin type that is no known embodiment at the time of this writing, no mention of all in Leviathan, and still gets some of the most infamous attacking skills in the game. The environmental storytelling almost explains itself, doesn't it? This little tumbleweed's done none of the legwork, but still has so much going for it. Plus, with Heathcliff, the man most known for having envy skills, getting his chapter a week after writing this, we'll probably get an info dump about this sucker pretty soon. That's not true. I wrote this before the Kanto came out, and we got jack shit, so let's just move on. But rather than wait a few weeks, I'm gonna take a guess at what this one means. See, envy skills are associated with the charge status, which is an energy source that the sinners can store up before spending as fuel on some powerful attacks. Considering that this guy's got a revenge story on the horizon, I'm seeing this as envy being about taking something seen as good, useful, or wholesome, and twisting it into something unrecognizable. Hi, Future Frey here again. Now that Kanto 6 is out and done, I'm willing to stand by this being the intended interpretation of envy. And with that, we now have all the sins accounted for, and just one thing left to address. These cover the abilities of the sinners in their current state. But remember the 2 rings from Shin I mentioned earlier? Well, I kinda lied. While it's true that the sinners currently can't make use of those rings, it's more because everyone that has been able to use them has been shown to be either immensely powerful, or at least out of the sinner's league. But with Kanto 6 releasing around the time of this video, we know there is a tier of power that Limbus has not shown us yet. And just maybe, they're not talking about enemies. Nope. Nothing came of this. We didn't get Aleph enemies, we didn't get Aleph ego, we're not getting that yet. Whatever does come of it though, I'm sure it'll stay in our minds for a long time. Yo, thanks for making it here. This video was fully written out before I had anything planned for Kanto 6, so the vibe's a little different from the more recent stuff. But while we're here, I promise to give a few shoutouts. First of all, to the new YouTube members like Just Amelia and Snow Era, and then another shout out to Cynthia, who not only became a member, but gave memberships to all of these people. And lastly, shout out to YouTube user Gigablast4129 for being the closest guest on the Carmen video about what the levers on Kathy's coffin did before the Kanto even finished. They ended up doing nothing, but it was also the only comment made about the levers before Part 3 released, so hey, you win by default. Congrats! Beyond that, take care, goons, and sin responsibly.